On Monday, February 9th, 2004, Maura Murray moved through her day with the outward shape of normal life classes. Emails, errands, yet almost every small action she took carried the quiet weight of someone preparing to leave. She was 21 years old, a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and she had once been a cadet at West Point before transferring. To people around her, she could seem disciplined and self-contained, the kind of young woman who kept moving even when something inside her was unraveling. Sometime shortly after midnight, while most of campus was asleep, Maura used her computer to look up directions on MapQuest, first to the Berkshires, then to Burlington, Vermont. It was not the kind of search that proves intent on its own, but it's one of those details that sits at the edge of the story like a faint footprint, a sign that her mind was already somewhere else, mapping an exit. By early afternoon, her communications began to form a pattern. At around 1 p.m., she emailed her boyfriend, ending with a promise to call later. She also made a call about renting a condo at a Bartlett, New Hampshire association connected to places her family had stayed before. And she called a fellow nursing student ordinary actions on paper, but striking in context because they happened in the same small window of time, as if she were checking doors and testing possibilities. Then came the message that would become one of the most cited lines in this. Tlerkazi. Maura emailed her professors and a work supervisor to say she would be gone for about a week because of a death in the family. Her relatives later said there had been no such death. It wasn't just a lie. It was a specific kind of lie, one that shuts down questions, one that creates instant privacy, one that gives a person permission to vanish without anyone chasing the details to closely for a few days. If you strip Maura's story down to the bones, this is one of the central mysteries. Was she improvising, reacting to something she couldn't bear? Or was she deliberately building a small paper wall between herself and the people who might have stopped her? That email doesn't tell us why she left, but it tells us she wanted time without explanation, time without friction, time where no one would immediately call campus police because a student missed a shift or skipped class. Later that afternoon, the preparations became physical. At 3:40 p.m., Maura withdrew $280 from an ATM. Security footage showed she was alone. Soon after, she went to a nearby liquor store and spent around $40 on alcohol items reported as including Bailey's Irish Cream, Kahlua, vodka, and a box of wine, and the footage again showed she was alone. These details matter because they remove one easy explanation. There's no confirmed companion in those images. No friend leaning against her shoulder, no older figure waiting near the door. Whatever she was doing, she appeared to be doing it by herself. There is a particular kind of tension that forms when a person's actions look both ordinary and loaded at the same time. People buy alcohol every day. People withdraw cash every day. But in missing person cases, sequence is everything. The ATM withdrawal isn't simply money, it's mobility. The liquor purchase isn't simply alcohol. It's a decision to bring something with her into whatever came next, whether that next chapter was meant to be a quiet weekend away, a private breakdown, or something darker. At some point that same day, Maura also picked up accident report forms from the Registry of Motor Vehicles. It's a detail that can be interpreted in multiple directions: responsible preparation, an administrative errand, or something connected to earlier stress, but it's part of the documented thread of her movements. In a case where so much is speculation, the hard facts of a cold, stubborn power, she did these things. She went to these places. She was seen alone sometime between 4 o'clock and 5 p.m. Maura left the UMass Amherst area in her car. The exact moment is not pinned down to a single verified timestamp, but the departure window is widely reported. And by 4:37 p.m., she checked her voicemail, her last recorded use of her cell phone. After that, The digital trail goes quiet. No more calls to be confirmed. No more location breadcrumbs. Just an empty stretch of road and time. And that silence is one of the most unsettling aspects of this story. It begins before Maura disappears. It begins while she is still technically present in the world. It begins in the way she didn't tell anyone where she was going. In the way her excuse created a temporary shield. In the way she moved alone through the final recorded errands of her day. There is no confirmed message that says, "I'm heading to New Hampshire." No friend on record who was told to expect her. No public proof that she had a destination waiting. Investigators have said there is no indication she informed anyone of her plans. And to this day, there is no consensus evidence of a chosen endpoint. From here, the story turns from preparation into motion northbound highways. Winter air, a route that leads away from campus life and into rural darkness. If you imagine her driving, it's easy to make the scene cinematic. Headlights on asphalt, trees on either side, the sense of distance growing with every mile. But what matters isn't the mood. It's the reality that she was. Heading into a place where small mistakes become large. Where a 10-minute gap can swallow a person whole. Where the difference between a helpful stranger and the wrong stranger can be the last choice someone ever makes. What we know, with reasonable documentation, is that she likely traveled north via Interstate 91. We know her last cell activity is recorded at. For 37 p.m. we know she had cash. We know she had alcohol. We know she had just told the people responsible for her schedule that she would be away for a week due to a family death that didn't occur. And we know that, hours later, she would be linked to a crash on Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, a crash that became the hinge point of one of America's most talked about disappearances. But before we arrive at that roadside moment, it's worth pausing on the psychological geometry of the day itself. There is a reason this case has lasted so long in public consciousness. It's not simply that Maura went missing. It's that she appears to have stepped out of her life with no clean explanation. If she was running from something, what was it? If she was running towards something, what was it? If she wasn't running at all, and the trip was meant to be nothing more than a private reset, why did it end in disappearance? True crime audiences don't stay for mystery alone. They stay for the feeling that each detail is a thread, and that if you pull the right one, the whole pattern will reveal itself. Maura's story is full of threads. The MapQuest searches, the email about a death, the cash withdrawal, the liquor purchase, the final voicemail check. Each one is small enough to explain away. Together, they form a quiet sequence that feels intentional, even if we can't prove what the intention was. And then there's the simplest, most haunting question that lives beneath all of it. Why did no one stop her? Maura was not a ghost moving through the world. She was a student on a campus full of people. She had responsibilities. She had relationships. Yet she was able to leave with no confirmed farewell, no verified destination, no one raising an alarm until it was too late. The email bought time. The silence protected her. The road did the rest. In the style of the investigative scripts that go viral, the kind you just showed me, this is where you let the audience feel the click of inevitability, not because the ending is known. It isn't, but because the shape of the day suggests a narrowing corridor. A person makes a private decision. That decision sets off smaller choices. Those smaller choices create momentum. And once momentum exists, the world has a way of meeting it with an accident, a stranger, a wrong turn, a moment of panic. When Maura drove away from Amherst that afternoon, she carried with her the last confirmed pieces of her story. A lie that created a one-week absence, cash for the road, alcohol for reasons no one can confirm, and a destination no one can name with certainty. By the time the sun fell and the temperature dropped, Maura Murray was no longer just a student who'd stepped away for a week. she was a vehicle moving north into New Hampshire into a stretch of road that, later that night, would become the last place on Earth where anyone can say, with any confidence at all, that she was still there. As the evening of February 9th, 2004 settled over northern New Hampshire, the road Maura Murray was traveling became quieter, darker, and far less forgiving. Route 112, also known as Wild Avenue 6. Road winds through a rural stretch of Haverhill where houses are spaced far apart and the forest presses close to the pavement. In winter, the landscape absorbs sound, snowbanks dull noise, trees block sight lines. At night, headlights carve narrow tunnels through the dark, and anything outside that beam effectively disappears. Sometime around 7:27 p.m., Maura's Saturn sedan left the roadway and struck a snowbank near a sharp curve. The impact wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to disable the car. Later assessments suggested front-end damage, and a deployed airbag would be consistent with the force involved. It was the kind of crash that instantly transforms a routine drive into a crisis, especially for someone alone. At night, in freezing temperatures, miles from familiar ground. A nearby resident, Butch Atwood, was inside his home when he heard the sound of the crash. Atwood was a school bus driver who lived just down the road, and when he looked outside, he could see the disabled vehicle. He stepped out and walked toward the scene. By his account, Maura was standing near the car, visibly shaken but upright. She did not appear seriously injured. Atwood asked if she needed help. She declined and told him she had already called roadside assistance. That single exchange brief, ordinary on its surface, has been examined for 2 decades. According to Atwood, Maura didn't want the police called. He offered to do so anyway, and she again declined. The explanation that she had already contacted help would later prove problematic. There is no confirmed record of a call to roadside assistance or emergency services from her phone at that time. Her last known phone activity had occurred earlier in the afternoon. Whether she believed help was already on the way, or whether she simply wanted to avoid law enforcement, remains unclear. Atwood returned to his house and called 911 himself. The call was logged at approximately 7:42 p.m. That timestamp matters. It establishes the beginning of a narrow window, one that has become the most scrutinized gap in the entire case. From the moment Atwood last saw Maura near her car to the moment police arrived, fewer than 10 minutes passed. When the first officer reached the scene around 7:46 p.m., Maura was gone. Her car was still there, angled against the snowbank. Inside were her personal belongings. A box of wine had broken open, spilling liquid onto the interior. The airbags had deployed. The keys were not in the ignition. There were no clear footprints leading away from the vehicle, no obvious trail into the woods, no signs pointing up or down the road. The scene was, in a word, quiet. This is where Maura Murray's story turns from troubling to deeply unsettling. People vanish all the time, but they rarely do so within minutes of a confirmed sighting in a fixed location, with law enforcement already en route. The road was not a highway. Traffic was light there. Surrounding terrain was difficult, wooded, and cold. And yet, by the time help arrived, she had vanished completely. Police quickly began canvassing the area. They checked the immediate surroundings, shining flashlights along the road and into the nearby trees. There was no sign of Maura, no blood, no torn clothing, no obvious indication of which direction she might have gone. The temperature that night hovered well below freezing. Snow covered the ground. In theory, any significant movement away from the road should have left some trace. The absence of those traces has fueled endless debate. Some have argued that snowfall or wind could have obscured footprints. Others counter that the window was too short, the conditions too stable, for all evidence to disappear so cleanly It's one thing for tracks to fade over hours. It's another for them to be effectively non-existent minutes after a person leaves a vehicle. Inside the car, investigators noted items that added to the confusion. There was alcohol, but no indication it had been consumed at the scene. There were personal effects, including clothing and school materials. Nothing about the interior suggested a deliberate abandonment. If Maura intended to disappear voluntarily, leaving behind such essentials would have been an odd choice. If she planned to return after a short absence, the crash had clearly interrupted those plans. The question that hangs over this moment is simple but brutal. What did Maura do in those final minutes? One possibility is that she left the scene on foot, either to seek help or to avoid police. But where would she go? On the road she risked being seen by Atwood or the approaching cruiser. Into the woods, sheepsnow, un vent terrain, and Saint-Perch. Running blindly into the forest would have been dangerous, even for someone properly dressed and prepared, which Maura was not. Another possibility is that she accepted a ride from a passing motorist. Route 112 is not heavily traveled, but it is not entirely isolated either. A car could have passed through during that narrow window. If someone stopped, offered assistance, and she accepted, the interaction could have been over in seconds. But this theory raises its own questions. Why would she trust a stranger so quickly? Why would no one else see the vehicle? And why has no credible witness ever come forward to say they picked her up? There is also the uncomfortable reality that Maura had reason to avoid police contact. Earlier in her life, she had been involved in incidents related to credit card misuse and an earlier car accident involving her father's vehicle. While those events were not extreme, they could have influenced her state of mind. If she believed that police involvement would make her situation worse, especially if alcohol was in the car, panic could have driven her to make a sudden, risky decision. But panic alone does not explain disappearance without trace. Aswarjave. Incidents spread. Search efforts intensified. By the following day, organized teams were on the ground. Search dogs were brought in to track scent. Helicopters scanned from above. Volunteers combed the area, along the road and into the surrounding forest. The searches were extensive and, by most accounts, thorough. The dogs reportedly picked up a scent that followed the road east for a short distance before stopping abruptly. That detail has been interpreted in several ways. Some believe suggests Maura walked briefly along the road before entering a vehicle. Others argue scent tracking in cold, snowy conditions is unreliable. Like so many elements of this case, the evidence points in multiple directions without settling on any one. Despite repeated searches over days and weeks, nothing was found. No clothing, no personal items, no remains. The forest did not give her back. The absence of discovery shifted the investigation into a different phase. Law enforcement began expanding the radius, interviewing people who lived along the road, checking records, and attempting to reconstruct Maura's movements. Friends and family were notified. Her disappearance, initially treated as a possible accident or misadventure, began to take on a darker cast. What makes this phase of the story especially haunting is how ordinary it looked at first. A car accident. A young woman shaken but apparently unharmed. A neighbor offering help. A call to police. These are common elements in countless roadside incidents. But the outcome here defied that familiarity. Instead of resolution, there was a void. As days turned into weeks, the case drew national attention. True crime forums dissected every timeline discrepancy. Maps were redrawn, theories multiplied. Some believed Maura had deliberately vanished to start a new life. Others were convinced she had succumbed to the elements and simply had not been found yet. Still others suspected foul play, pointing to the eerie timing and lack of physical evidence. Through it all, one fact remained immovable. The last confirmed sighting of Maura Murray was on that dark New Hampshire road, standing beside her disabled car, declining help. That image of a young woman alone at night, insisting she was fine when she clearly was not, has become emblematic of the case. It captures the tension between appearance and reality, between what people say in moments of stress and what they actually need. It also marks the final moment when Maura was undeniably present in the world. After that, she becomes a question. Investigators have revisited the crash site countless times, measuring distances, reconstructing angles, testing visibility. Each revisit has produced more analysis, but not more answers. The road has remained silent. The woods have remained closed. And this is where the story deepens rather than concludes. Because the disappearance itself, those 10 minutes, cannot be understood in isolation. What happened next, in the days and years after Maura vanished, reveals as much about the mystery as the crash itself. It exposes investigative decisions, evolving theories, and the slow realization that this was not going to be a case with easy edges. In the next part, the focus shifts from the moment of disappearance to the long shadow it cast, the searches that turned up nothing, the theories that hardened into camps, and the unanswered questions that would come to define one of the most enduring missing person cases in modern American history. In the days after Maura Murray vanished from Route 112, the investigation moved from urgency into uncertainty. The initial assumption that she would be found nearby, perhaps injured or disoriented, began to fade as each search ended the same way, with nothing. The landscape around Haverhill was combed again and again. Volunteers lined up along the road, walking shoulder to shoulder through the snow. Search teams pushed deeper into the woods, checking ravines, stream beds, and areas that might have offered brief shelter from the cold. Helicopters passed overhead, their rotors beating against a silence that never answered back. For Maura's family, the waiting was unbearable. Her father, Fred Murray, arrived in New Hampshire within days and became one of the most visible figures in the search. He walked the roads himself, talked to neighbors, and retraced the route his daughter might have taken. Over time, he would return to the area again and again, convinced that the answer was still there, somewhere along that stretch of road. But each revisit ended the same way, with questions multiplying faster than facts. Law enforcement faced an immediate problem. There was no clear evidence of a crime. There was no body. There was no definitive proof that Maura had been harmed at all. In the early stages, the case was treated as a missing person investigation with the possibility of an accident. That framing influenced everything that followed. What resources were deployed, which theories were prioritized, and how the disappearance was explained to the public. The idea that Maura had wandered into the woods and died of exposure gained traction quickly. It was simple, tragic, and consistent with the environment. Winter in New Hampshire is unforgiving. Temperatures drop fast. Hypothermia can set in even in relatively mild conditions, especially for someone injured or under the influence. If Maura had panicked and fled the scene to avoid police, it seemed plausible that she could have become lost, collapsed, and simply never been found. But as time passed, that explanation began to strain. Experienced search and rescue personnel pointed out that bodies are usually recovered in such scenarios, even if it takes time. Clothing, personal items, or remains eventually surface. In Maura's case, nothing did. Multiple searches over different seasons turned up no trace. The forest did not yield her, even after years of scrutiny. Another theory took shape alongside it, that Maura had accepted a ride from someone passing through. The scent trail, reportedly ending along the road, supported this idea. For some, if she entered a vehicle, willingly or otherwise, it would explain the lack of footprints and the abrupt end of physical evidence. But this possibility raised darker implications. If Maura left with someone she didn't know, what happened next? Why had no one come forward? And how could such an encounter occur so cleanly, without witnesses, on a road where at least one neighbor was nearby? As these questions circulated, the investigation became increasingly fragmented, not just among the public, but within the broader conversation around the case. Different camps formed, each convinced their interpretation best fit the facts. Some believed Maura planned her disappearance and succeeded. They pointed to the MapQuest searches, the email about a family death, the cash withdrawal. To them, the crash was either accidental or staged, a disruption in a plan that otherwise worked. Others rejected that idea entirely. They argued that disappearing voluntarily is far more difficult than people assume. It requires money, preparation, and support, none of which Maura was shown to have in sufficient measure. Leaving behind her belongings, her bank accounts, and her identity would have made survival nearly impossible. And yet, no alternative explanation fully accounted for the evidence either. As the years passed, the case took on a life of its own. Online forums dissected every detail, sometimes with forensic precision, sometimes with wild speculation. Timelines were redrawn. Witness statements were reanalyzed. Minor inconsistencies were magnified into potential breakthroughs. At times, the sheer volume of analysis obscured the core reality. Despite thousands of hours of discussion, no new physical evidence had emerged. Law enforcement periodically revisited the case, announcing renewed searches or re-examinations. Each announcement sparked fresh hope, followed by familiar disappointment. Ground-penetrating radar was used in certain areas. Cadaver dogs were brought in again. Locations suggested by tips were checked. Nothing conclusive was ever found. For Maura's family, especially her father, this cycle was exhausting. Fred Murray spoke publicly about his belief that Maura had not intended to disappear forever. He emphasized her plans for the future, her school commitments, her relationships. To him, the idea that she had simply walked away from her life did not ring true. He focused instead on the crash site and the surrounding area, convinced that the key lay close to where she was last seen. At the same time, the prolonged uncertainty created tension between family members, investigators, and parts of the online community. Well-meaning amateurs sometimes crossed boundaries, contacting witnesses or accusing individuals without evidence. Rumors spread quickly, hardening into narratives that were difficult to undo. The line between investigation and intrusion blurred, adding another layer of complexity to an already fragile situation. One of the most troubling aspects of the case is how it illustrates the limits of certainty. Each theory seems plausible until examined closely, and then it fractures. Each piece of evidence seems significant until placed alongside everything else. Where it becomes ambiguous, the case resists simplification. It refuses to settle into a single, coherent story. And yet, the questions remain relentlessly human. What was Maura thinking in those final moments by the roadside? Was she afraid, determined, disoriented? Did she believe she was making a temporary choice that spiraled into permanence? Or was that choice taken from her altogether? The passage of time has only sharpened these questions. Years have turned into decades. New cases have risen and fallen in public attention, but Maura's name continues to surface. Her disappearance has become a reference point, a case people cite when discussing how someone can seemingly vanish into nothing. In many ways, the most unsettling element is not any single theory, but the absence of resolution itself. There is no final image, no confirmed outcome, no definitive answer that allows grief to settle into acceptance. Instead, There is a permanent state of not knowing, a limbo that stretches on, indifferent to the passage of years. As investigators exhausted traditional avenues, the case entered a quieter phase. Leads slowed, media attention waned, then returned in waves. The official status remained unchanged. Maura Murray was missing, presumed alive by some, presumed dead by others, but never found. The file stayed open, but thin. What remains is a story suspended in time. A young woman left campus on a February afternoon. Her car crashed on a dark road. She was seen, briefly, alive and speaking, and then she was gone. In the final part, the focus turns to what this disappearance has come to represent, not just for those who knew Maura, but for anyone confronted with the idea that certainty can vanish as completely as a person. It's a reflection on the silence left behind and on why, after all these years, this case still refuses to fade. As the years stretched on, Maura Murray's disappearance stopped being only an active investigation and became something harder to define, a space where grief, theory, and time overlapped. Officially, the case remained open. Practically, it lived in a gray zone where every new idea had to fight against the weight of everything that had already failed. For law enforcement, there were no obvious next steps. For the family, there was no clean ending. And for the public, the mystery hardened into something almost symbolic, proof that a person can vanish without explanation, even in the modern world. What complicated matters further was that Maura's case never settled into a single narrative. There was no confirmed crime scene beyond the roadside, no suspect ever formally named, no discovery that shifted the investigation decisively in one direction. Instead, the case became a collection of competing interpretations, each one plausible enough to survive, none strong enough to prevail. Some investigators continued to lean toward exposure. They argued that nature does not always give answers on human timelines. Bodies can be missed, remains can scatter. Forests can hide what people expect to find. In this view, Maura's disappearance was tragic but not sinister, a convergence of panic, winter conditions, and bad luck. Yet, even among professionals, that explanation carried discomfort. Experienced searchers had returned to the area multiple times, in different seasons, with different tools. Still nothing surfaced. The land did not behave the way theory said it should. Others focused on the possibility of a ride. The idea that Maura entered a vehicle during that brief window after the crash offered a clean explanation for the lack of physical evidence, but it also opened a door that could not easily be closed. If she left with someone else, the case moved from misadventure into the realm of potential crime. And yet, there was no pattern to anchor that suspicion, no similar disappearances tied to the area. No vehicle description, no credible witness stepping forward decades later with a confession or a memory strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Then there were those who believed Maura intended to disappear. They pointed to her emails, the cash withdrawal, the MapQuest searches. They argued that people underestimate how far someone can go with a small head start and a strong desire to escape. But even this theory ran into the same wall as the others. Maura left behind her identity. She left behind her bank accounts. She left behind a life that would have been extraordinarily difficult to abandon permanently without help. And no evidence of such help has ever been found. Over time, the debate itself became part of the story. The case attracted researchers, podcasters, writers, and amateur investigators. Many of them deeply committed to uncovering the truth. Some brought genuine insight. Others brought noise. The internet amplified everything useful analysis and baseless speculation alike. Accusations were made. Defenses were mounted. People on the periphery of the case found themselves scrutinized, sometimes unfairly, sometimes relentlessly. This attention had consequences. It strained relationships. It hardened positions. And in some ways, it made resolution even harder. When a case becomes a cultural phenomenon, every new lead is immediately judged not just by investigators, but by thousands of observers with their own theories and expectations. The pressure to be right can overshadow the patience required to be careful. For Maura's family, especially her father, the passage of time did not dull the urgency. If anything, it sharpened it. Fred Murray continued to speak publicly, to push for renewed searches, to challenge explanations that felt incomplete. His persistence kept the case alive when it might otherwise have faded into archival silence. At the same time, it underscored the emotional cost of not knowing. Living without answers is not a static experience. It evolves, reopening wounds in new forms as years pass without resolution. What makes Maura's disappearance endure is not just the mystery of what happened, but the way it exposes the fragility of certainty. We like to believe that with enough technology, enough cameras, enough data, nothing truly disappears. Maura's case stands as a quiet rebuttal to that belief. She vanished not in the wilderness of a remote continent, but on a road in New England, within minutes of a 911 call in a country saturated with infrastructure. In the end, there is no final image to hold on to, no confirmed last step, no proof of life or proof of death. Only a series of moments frozen in time, a student sending emails, a car leaving campus, headlights on a rural road, a brief conversation beside a crashed vehicle, and then absence. The question, what happened to Maura Murray, has been asked for more than 2 decades. It has never received an answer that holds. And perhaps that is why the case continues to resonate. It is not just about one young woman, but about the unsettling realization that disappearance does not always come with explanation, ansomi. Stories, and not with a conclusion, but with a permanent blank space. Somewhere between Amherst and that bend in Route 112. Maura Murray's life split in 2, everything before, carefully documented, and everything after, unknowable. The road remains. The snow falls and melts each year. People drive past the site without knowing its history. And the silence that followed her disappearance remains as complete now as it was on that February night.